And welcome back to the OHIO podcast, everybody. I'm your host, Buckeye Boggs, and I'm joined by a very special guest tonight, Zack Gugenheim from the Big Ten Football Talk podcast. We're going to talk a little bit about yesterday's big national signing day, Ohio State's place in that, and the big picture with Ohio State versus the rest of the conference when it comes to recruiting, what that's going to mean looking towards the future. Zack, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to, on my show, I try to be as balanced and I think very contextually. I'm still going to think in context tonight, but I can rep Ohio State a bit more. I grew up a Buckeye, and so you might get a little bit more of my homerness coming out tonight. But
That's
I'm
all
excited.
right, my man. That's all right. I tell you what, before we jump into your homerness, where can everybody find the Big Ten Football Talk podcast at? And give a little background about yourself.
Yeah, so where you can find the podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast. We a little bit on YouTube, but really it's I would say it's more the audio stuff. So you can find us there. We're on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it these days. Instagram, you can email me at big10footballtalk@gmail.com. I love connecting with different fans and getting questions and whatnot. So, but definitely give us a listen over there. Background, grew up an Ohio State fan, but got into ministry, and that's my main calling. But back around the pandemic, I was looking for hobbies, and I like legit will talk about football just to myself and like think about it. And I was like, man, I should really just talk about this. And a friend of mine, we actually had considered doing kind of like a first take type of show for a while. In fact, we have a pilot episode recorded. We were talking about the debate between Michael Jordan and LeBron James, who's the GOAT. I'm MJ all the way, which might be controversial in Ohio, but
It's not.
oh, okay, good. I'm a '90s kid, so I got to go MJ. But
Yeah, me too.
I kind of already had like the outer workings of like making a podcast, and I was so excited for college football to return to normal in 2021, or at least more normal. And so I remember that first Big Ten game, Illinois, Nebraska, and I'm like, I'm going to talk about it on a podcast and see if anyone wants to listen. And then people listened, and I was like, oh, cool. Like, people actually care what I have to think and say about football. So that was 3 years ago, and it's grown since then. And I just love, especially with the way the landscape is changing, and not just the way the landscape's changing, but also I feel like the mainstream media often miss some of the nuance in the sport that I feel like I really appreciate and care about. And so, and I'm sure you do as well, and many others. And I think fans are yearning for that more reasoned take. So I think that's a lot of my background of why I continue the podcast is I think there's a lot of discussion to be had, not on the mainstream level, but more in the nuance space of how is college football working for different teams. Everybody makes fun of teams like Iowa, right? But there's a lot to be said about the fact that they just won 10 games again. We can leave the nepotism aside for with Brian Ferentz and whatnot, but there's Iowa's not celebrated a lot in the national media, but I feel like there's a lot to celebrate. And Rutgers having a great season this year at 6-6, what they accomplished with their schedule and all that stuff. So that stuff gets me really excited because we can sit here and talk about how great Ohio State is all day, and they are great. But you get some of these fun stories of how Shiano is building. David Braun is doing great things at Northwestern, what he accomplished this year. And then, of course, realignment and seeing what's going to happen there. So those are the things I get really jazzed up about.
Yeah. We did a podcast the other night where we broke down the entire Ohio State class. We're not going to do that tonight. If you want to go back, go back, listen to that episode. We're going to open up more horizons here and look at what Ohio State accomplished in comparison to the rest of the Big Ten. And I want to start right here first. You have 4 new schools coming in next year, all of them on the West Coast. That's not something that most Big Ten schools have had to worry about is recruiting on the West Coast. Now you have to pay attention to it. And Ohio State has a rival in recruiting finally. Now, what Michigan has done on the field against us in the last 3 years, you can argue whether cheating aside, they've won the games. Okay, and
Mhm.
I acknowledge that they have beaten us 3 years in a row. Not sure it's going to stand, but they have done that. That aside, Oregon is a legitimate recruiting threat to Ohio State in their Midwest recruiting crown, simply based off of number one, what they did this past year in the recruiting is incredible. But I think their NIL is probably, as they come into the Big Ten, the strongest in the conference. Agree or disagree?
Oh, absolutely. When you asked me to do this, the thing that really stood out, one, Oregon, in the composite, they're behind Ohio State, but just according to 247, they're ahead. And a big part of that, Dan Lanning, people hate the comparison of like SEC schools. It ruffles feathers in the Big Ten. It ruffles my feathers. But there is a reality that SEC teams have a blueprint of building along the lines, getting fast guys on the outside.
Yeah.
And Dan Lanning is that type of guy. And you look at that class, Aiden Ireland and Elijah Rushing, they anchor the next wave of D linemen. Both are 5-star prospects on the defensive line. You get Dylan Gabriel and Dante Moore in the transfer portal. And that's a big piece of this, right? Like it's National Signing Day paired with the transfer portal. And the thing that just struck me was I'm like, Oregon might be the favorite in the Big Ten next year. And I think some of it is the way that they're attacking the portal. But then you look at their recruiting, and I totally agree with you. I mean, we joke about Phil Knight and Nike, but I mean, you got some serious cachet there. And there's no better athletic brand out there, or at least no more mainstream brand than Nike. And so I just look at Oregon, the way they're
Excuse me.
positioned. I think you have a great take there because, and then you compare them to the rest of the Pac 12 teams. USC is hemorrhaging.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they had an okay class, but you look at all they're losing in the transfer portal. I mean, they're hemorrhaging. UCLA was like,
Let's take a quick rabbit there. What is happening to USC? Like
uh,
most Big Ten people, most Ohio State people know very little of what's going on outside of Columbus and Ann Arbor, okay,
yeah,
and maybe Penn State. We have to pay attention to this stuff now, guys. What is happening in Los Angeles with USC? It's crazy to me.
I think Alex Grinch hoodwinked them for a few years. First of all, um, I don't know what happened. I think I don't know why so many people are leaving. I do think the new USC defensive coordinator, who they got from UCLA, Danton Lynn, is an upgrade there. But the momentum has completely collapsed. We were on the Big Ten huddle the other night, and I think it was Jr. that mentioned that I think when boosters hired, or that when they supported Lincoln Riley and the hiring there, he got his quarterback, he got a number of key players, and it seemed like everything was going to go well. And instead, what has happened is that defense has been atrocious. Caleb Williams was Superman the year before in 2022, but even then they couldn't beat a power team in Utah. And then you get to this year, and 7-5, Caleb Williams is most likely out the door. You're losing all these defensive prospects that were 4 and 5 star kids. Their recruiting class was one step above Nebraska nationally. That ain't good. And then you pair that with their schedule next year. This is what baffles me about their schedule. They have LSU and Notre Dame out of conference. They go to Michigan. They host Penn State. They host Nebraska. They go to Washington. Like, forget playoffs. Are they going to be bowl eligible next year?
Holy crap!
I mean, it's an insane schedule, and I think I didn't see that Will Howard was guaranteed. in, but like I've heard that he's the guy that's coming in to transfer from Kansas State. He's not Caleb Williams,
Mm-mm.
and they didn't get a great quarterback recruit in this class. So they've got talent, but they don't have a Superman to save them. And so, like, what do you do?
Yeah. So it feels like, as far as the recruiting class, that the momentum of losing several games this year and the way they lost them, you know, has just kind of bled over into the recruiting. Um,
Mhm.
when you go to LA for the glitz and the glamour, and there's no glitz and there's no glamour, what do you really have? I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of what I look. When USC's clicking, boy, they're good. But when
Yeah.
they're not, it's a train wreck. It is like, in a lot of ways, it mirrors Hollywood. When
Yeah.
it's good, when it's a good movie, man, it's a good movie. But when it's not, it's crash and burn.
Yeah. Well, and you bring up a good point, Eric, because, glitz and glamour is there, but why is that glitz and glamour there? Go back to those old Pete Carroll teams. They were built on superior line play, nasty defense. I mean, everybody talked about Reggie Bush, Lendale White, all those boys, but that defense, like I still remember that Orange Bowl where they suffocated a really good Oklahoma Sooner offense with Adrian Peterson and all those guys. And it was the defense. It was the nasty boys up front that were mucking things up for everybody. And I mean, I don't know if they had defensive players on the field this year. I mean, they were so bad.
They were
And
bad.
and to your point, you had Caleb Williams, who's the glitziest player, right? He's great, but you got to have toughness, and you're going to come to the Big Ten where you got to face teams like Wisconsin, Iowa, who will muck things up in the middle. I mean, even without Ohio State on the schedule, and I don't think Oregon's on the schedule either. But I mean, it's just I would not. I think Lincoln Riley's in a lot of trouble. Like I think it's very possible that next year, if they're not in the top 5 of the conference, he might be packing his bags.
Washington, let's stay out west real fast. Washington's in the college football playoff, yet they are 10th in the Big Ten rankings in recruiting. Is Washington essentially Michigan State in the 2000s, where they have a good national brand team about once every 3 to 4 years that they build up, and then it's back to rebuilding it again? Is that essentially what Washington is?
Yeah, that's a great comparison. It's a great comparison because and Kalen DeBoer has done just a great job. But you look at how this roster was built, right? Michael Penix transfers in. He had a year to get comfortable, and now their receiving core is just a shade under Ohio State's. I mean, they are just ridiculously talented, good running back, but they're losing a lot of that, and they're built
Mhm.
a lot on senior laden team. They got to build. They got to get the right people, the right culture. I think at their best, they're better than Michigan State, and I think they can distinguish themselves a bit too because Michigan State always has to compete with Michigan. They always have to compete. Whereas Washington, they can be their own brand and they can recruit more of the Pacific Northwest and they can probably get a little bit more into California, certainly more California than Michigan State can. Even with Jonathan Smith there now, I don't think he's going to be able to get too many kids from out west to East Lansing. But I do think that comparison of build up, maybe have a couple down years, build back up, couple. I think that's a good way to look at it, and I think that you see that with their class here. Like it's good, but it's not what you would expect from a playoff team.
Right, right. Neither's Michigan, but we'll get to that in a minute,
Hmm.
because that's a whole nother interesting discussion that I'm sure we'll get a lot of hate mail about. Um, Nebraska, Matt Rule, him getting Dylan Rayola, is that a sign, a signal that Nebraska is going to be back?
I'm gonna answer that with a non-answer. Well, because I don't. it's a good question. Everybody asks it, like, are they, Texas for years? Are they
Uh-huh.
back? Sam Ellinger is smiling somewhere. But I think what it says is that they can be a place where elite talent comes to again. And I think that's a big deal. Even if Dylan Raiola leaves in a year and transfers.
Which is a very good chance given
Yeah,
his track record.
right, right. He's left what? He's transferred high schools, he's flipped
Four
twice.
times,
Yeah,
three
yeah.
times.
Yeah, it's so like yet it signals to the rest of the college football world and to the Big Ten, hey, you can come to Nebraska as an elite prospect. And you can come because we're building something here. And I compared it a little bit on the Big Ten huddle to Colorado and Deion Sanders. And the difference, this would be the difference though, is I think Deion is he has not proven that he's a program builder yet. He's proven that he's had some sizzle and he can get immediate results. And I don't want to. I know people are sick of Colorado, but 4-8 going from 1-11 with the train wreck that Colorado was to like that. It's not a small feat what they accomplished this year. Now I don't. Looking at the recruiting class and some of the transfer stuff, I'm like, I don't know if it's going to keep going. Matt Rule is very different. Like he knows what it takes to build a program. And you saw it at Temple, you saw it at Baylor, and those are places where you are not going to get the same traction, the same alumni support, all that type of stuff. I mean, those Nebraska fans, I think Nebraska fans might be the most loyal. Like, I mean, they have been thick and thin with that program over the past 10 years, and it's been a disastrous 10
They
years.
they packed out the stadium for a volleyball game.
Yeah, yeah,
I
that's a
mean,
really good point.
I don't think Ohio State does that. I'm just being honest with you. Like
Yeah,
we're football crazy. Nebraska is Nebraska crazy.
yeah,
That's the
yeah. That's
difference.
yeah, and that's a really. I appreciate you bringing up that distinction because, and I would even say, and I say this about myself, like when our quarterback gets sacked, we're like, fire the coaches. Oh my gosh. Whereas like Nebraska, like they wanted to see Scott Frost succeed. They wanted so like he was the favored son, and now that Matt Rule's come, and they have had heartbreak in about a dozen different ways over the past 3 years, whether it's games or players or whatnot. So going back to Dylan Raiola, you have a figurehead now to attach yourself to, and you have a proven team builder. And you're now in an arrangement where I think you have different pipelines that come up. Like I think Nebraska with a commitment like Raiola now can go to California or go to the East Coast or go to the Midwest and say, hey, we're building something here. See all that glitz and glamour over at USC and it's not doing anything? Come to Nebraska. We'll get some things done here. And I don't think next year, although they could be 7-0 going into Ohio State next year. But I think the next couple years, that question, are they back? Maybe. Like I think this is the start of something big for Nebraska.
Sneaky good recruiting class. Who had the sneakier good recruiting class? Wisconsin or Purdue?
Oh, when you first said sneaky, I was like, oh, Purdue. But Wisconsin had a good one too.
Wisconsin sneaky good too.
Well, it's like, oh, who are their 4-star prospects? Oh, unoffensive tackle, tight end, a running back, and I'm like, oh, it's the Wisconsin recruiting class. Okay, cool. Wisconsin needs they need the receivers to make Phil Longo's offense like zing because they've got everything like they're building all in all the right places except for receiver at this point.
You know where that's where Julian Fleming really should have went.
Yeah, has he committed? Has he committed to Penn State
Not
or
yet.
that's where the smoke is though. which is so ironic. I've nothing but love for Fleming. He's a hope he does well. But yeah, that's a good point. Like he really should look like he would be a really good number one or number two option up there. Purdue, the thing that struck me is they didn't get a lot of four-star prospects, but who they got was safeties. And I'm like, what was Ryan Walters' specialty at Illinois? Defensive backfield. So Coy Beasley, Luke Williams, like those are two really key guys. I think Tavian Galloway is an underrated prospect at tight end. They got a couple of key transfers. Cam Brown from UCLA, Reggie Love from Illinois. And again, it doesn't. Neither team blows you like it blows you away, which again I think is similar to Michigan, right? We'll talk about Michigan a lot, I'm sure. Oh man, I'm gonna say Purdue just because that was my first, like my knee jerk. But yeah, Wisconsin had a sneaky good class, and I totally forgot about this. Getting Tyler Van Dyke out of Miami is that's not a signing day thing, but I mean it really does. I think that really elevates them moving forward, especially if they get the lines, if their lines progress like I think they can.
Okay. Okay. Another good question here for you. Based off of what you saw on signing day, which program falls back to being under 500 in the bottom of the Big Ten first? Maryland or Rutgers?
Oh, that's good. Oh man, that's really hard. I like what Rutgers did more.
Me too.
They got the receivers they needed, right? They got Demir Miller from Monmouth as a transfer, and then their best recruit was Antonio White out of Georgia. And so the fact that they got into Georgia and got a four-star wide receiver to come up to New Jersey, I think that's just a good sign for Rutgers. Rutgers is a tough schedule next year. Like even though they get out of the East, they got to go to USC. I actually would like Rutgers against USC if it was at home, but they got to go to USC. Maryland, I haven't. I need to look at Maryland's schedule more, but I'll say Maryland based on personnel, but I would not be surprised if it's. I'm giving you a non-answer, but I'll say Maryland, but I think Rutgers does have a tougher schedule next year.
Watch Maryland in the bowl game. That's going to tell you a lot.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Let's look at Iowa. Now that Iowa will no longer have the West to be their cushion to getting to Indiana, um, are we seeing, based off of what we're seeing in recruiting, and it's just another Iowa recruiting class? I feel like this is kind of the last dying breaths of the Ferentz coaching career. Like I look at the class, there was nothing that was like, no Xavier Nwakpa, no, like I just don't think there's anything there. Even the best kid in Iowa, which was the tight end, I think went to Nebraska.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I feel like this was Iowa's last hurrah, and I don't think we see them in the Big Ten championship game or a college football playoff in a very long time.
Yeah, and it's set, like I love Kirk. Although I feel like he's gotten crankier as he's gotten older. It just kind of feels like he's always complaining about something. And I can understand. He's been there for a long time. He's been very successful, and then you have to fire your son. It's not a fun gig. It's hard because I agree with you. I agree with you like 99%, but there's still. I'll put it this way. I think there's enough, and again, I need to look at schedules. I think there's enough possibility where Iowa can elevate if they have the right development, and that's the key. The right development, the right offensive coordinator, the right where they could get, an easier schedule, and then you get a Michigan or a Penn State and a Washington where they either have down years or they just don't play their A game and they get them. Back 2017 when Iowa got Ohio State after the Penn State win, you're like, oh yeah, this will be an easy win, and then that game.
Curb stomped us.
Yeah, it was awful. And you're like, how did Nate Stanley do that to us? It was Nate Stanley, right? He was the quarterback. Anyway, that's a memory I don't want to rehash for
It
anybody.
was JT Barrett. That was the quarterback.
Yeah. Well, I was
how many how many pick sixes, buddy? After his
my
very
God.
best football game ever as a Buckeye.
I
Lays
felt
an egg.
so bad for Barrett. I love him. But yeah, so I think Iowa. So I think you're right. I just I think there could be a year or two even in the near future because Michigan's losing a lot. James Franklin sometimes outcoaches himself, and it's like, what are you doing? So I see a pathway there for Iowa, but again, my issue with Iowa always is what's your margin for error? And their margin for error this year in the Big Ten West was so slim. I mean, that they got beat by Minnesota, who I think is a terrible team right now. And so that would be I think the margin for error continues to shrink, would be how I would answer that.
I think that's fair, in all honesty. I look at teams like Minnesota and Iowa, and I think as Matt Rule begins to build his program in Nebraska, those are the schools, and Luke Fickell in Wisconsin, as they begin to take steps forward, those schools will naturally take steps back. And it's not even a West division thing. It's just regional. Like regionally, you just, the recruits are slimmer pickings there, and the style of play you play is not conducive to keeping up with the Ohio States and the Oregons and the USCs when USC is doing good things. Let's talk a little bit about Penn State and Michigan, and I'm lumping them together on purpose. In the rankings yesterday, they are a third and fourth in the Big Ten. I think they're what is it 14th and 15th or something like that.
Yep, you got it.
Nationally, a lot of commits, a lot of signees. 27 for Michigan, 25 for Penn State. And I just feel like Penn State's opportunity slipped through their fingertips again this year. Mm-hmm. This was supposed to be the year. This was, you've been recruiting at a better clip, and this was going to be the year, and you go 0-2, and your recruiting goes right back to where it was.
Yeah.
Now, I do think the hire was good.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that was a good creative hire.
Yeah,
I do think Penn State is still going to be Penn State, but that's just it. They're going to be Penn State, and that means you're going to take a backseat to Ohio State. You're going to take a backseat to Michigan. You're now going to take a backseat to Oregon, and you might even take a backseat to USC.
Yeah, I think next year is the last year of the window for Penn State from an on-field perspective. But you're right. Like Penn State did not do anything to progress, which it seemed like that's where they were going in the past couple of recruiting classes. I think on the flip side, Michigan, it's funny. I saw a lot of people, in a sense, kind of throwing shade at Michigan. And my thought was, this is what Michigan does every year, and they beat us 3 years in a row. And what they do is they find their guys, they find a few complementary guys in the portal who fit their scheme, fit their system, and they develop them. And so I'm like, I don't really care what Michigan does in recruiting anymore because they get their guys and they're set. Whereas I think Penn State, and this is where, there's philosophy and identity and things like that. Michigan wants to be the blue collar team. Like they want to be the ones that hit you in the mouth And you heard Roman Wilson, dogging the corners for Ohio State after the game, which ticks me off to no end. But they want to play with that chip on their shoulder. They want the workman like mentality. That's who they are. I don't think Penn State really knows who they are,
Mm.
and I felt that even. I don't know much about the quarterback they got, Grunkemeyer. He's an Ohio QB, but I think he's more of a drop back guy. I don't think Penn State's ever been good with a drop back passer, at least under Franklin. And I remember I was at Penn State in ministry when what's his name, Hackenberg was there, and when he was under Bill O'Brien, was really progressing. Seemed like he was really good. As soon as Franklin got there, like every time Hackenberg dropped back, I'm like, I could telegraph the play. And if I can telegraph the play from my couch, like you think that other teams aren't going to telegraph it because the way he's pointing his foot or the way he dropped back or that it was just so easy. And I feel like you see some of the same things with Drew Aller. And like I just don't think I think they want the big armed quarterback, but they don't know what to do with them. And then you don't have receivers to throw. They got a great tight end, but I'm like, you need more than that. You need more. And so I really agree. I think Penn State is. I think they're a really good team. I think they're a really good program. But I think if they want to elevate, and I would say Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan, I think are in that upper tier as we get to next year. I think Penn State is a tier below. I think they can get to that upper tier next year, but this recruiting class does not help them.
Mm-mm. No, no. Julian Fleming will help if he
Yeah,
decides to go there, but um, he had dropsies a lot this year too. So it's like I, you know, I want to throw shade at James Franklin because it's easy to do, um, but it's just become so underwhelming. You know what I mean? It's at this point, who are you? Like I think you made a great point. What identity do you have? I would say, who are you? Like who is
yeah,
Penn State? They make a little bit of noise, and then you find out they're the Nittany Kittens. You know,
yeah.
it's there's not a whole lot of substance there. You make also a very good point about about Michigan. I really want to dog them right now because on Twitter yesterday, their fan base was more concerned about trying to throw shade at Ohio State celebrating who we got as opposed to celebrating who they got. They didn't even talk about it.
Yeah.
Like, I think they're so enamored with what they have this year. If this thing crashes and burns on them this year, I really do think that their failures inside of recruiting move them down to that second tier, in my opinion. I think they go back to um, early Jim Harbaugh years.
Yeah, I'm curious. If I can turn the table, I'd love to hear your thought. Like,
Hmm.
what are you hearing about what could happen to Michigan? Because I think I am trying to not project because I just don't know what the NCAA do. I don't trust the NCAA as far as I could throw them. But I'm curious, as you guys have talked on this show, like what are your thoughts of what will happen to Michigan? And because I think that really does influence what happens to them in the future.
Well, I think what the NCAA does with this first initial hearing about Burgergate is going to tell you a lot about what they think about the cheating scandal. If and the fact that they came out with a very strong response this week on National Signing Day, mind you, is not lost on me, nor should be lost on anybody else who's paying attention.
Hmm.
Jim Harbaugh is going to Pete Carroll this thing. You mark it down. I think if he gets the opportunity to skate to the NFL, he's going to because I do think the NCAA is going to put some kind of sanctions on Michigan.
Hmm.
I really do. Um, I don't have an inside source telling me that, but the people who I trust who do have inside sources are telling me that's what's going to happen. They're going to lose games, and Jim Harbaugh is going to get punished by the NCAA. And I think that did affect recruiting a little bit for them. And I
Yeah.
also think it could affect recruiting for them big time in the future because that identity that you speak of is created by the fact that when Jim Harbaugh was 0-5, he said to himself, "It's do or die." And by hook or by crook, mostly by crook,
Yep.
uh, he pushed all his chips to the middle. Now we're finding out that he might have been holding some cards up his sleeve, but either way, give the man credit. You know, he created a culture of toughness that Ryan Day has not gotten back up off the canvas from. He's
Yep.
trying, but it's becoming a harder battle for Ryan Day than what we anticipated it being. As in all honesty, as a Ohio State fan, but I am holding out hope and faith, and I believe that the NCAA might come down harder on Michigan based off of what I'm hearing from the people I trust than what their fan base wants to believe. They are in
Yeah.
complete denial right now that they even did anything wrong, let alone they're going to get in trouble from the NCAA. Now, Zach, I agree with you. The NCAA has no teeth. At least I didn't think they did,
Yeah.
but they are showing a keen interest in Jim Harbaugh. And the tinfoil hat wearing Michigan fans will tell you, well, that's because Jim's for the players. I think that's a bunch of BS. If you listen
Yeah.
to every single major coach on National Signing Day, they all said the same thing about paying players.
Yep.
So that's
Yeah.
hogwash.
Yeah. Well, and I think I appreciate that perspective because I think especially it's been so out of sight, out of mind. I think since the Ohio State Michigan game, at least for me anyway. I know it hasn't been for a lot of people. It's helpful to have that perspective. I agree with you too. I think the NCAA hates multiple things, all of them having to do with when they feel spurned. And if you look at this whole thing, whether it's the recruiting stuff or the sign stealing, lying, like all that stuff, it's ugh. And yeah, I think you're right. That's a good thought. But yeah, that's my final thought on that.
You got to play it a little bit more safe than me. Like our tagline here is we talk about Buckeyes and we hate on Michigan. So
Oh,
it's
good.
okay.
Okay.
I mean, that's
Okay.
what we do here. So
Okay.
I'm here
Down
for
with
all
the
the heat.
weasels. Okay. Um,
I know you got to be a little bit more careful in what you
yeah.
say on your show, but here, forget them.
I like it. I like it.
All right. So last question. Considering when we talk about National Signing Day and recruiting, um, are you surprised Ohio State was able to hold it together? And what does that mean in your eyes when it comes to Ohio State NIL collective in the future?
Yeah, so I feel like this is it's a great question. And I feel like we could go in several different directions. One is I think it's a big deal that they kept Edric Houston. I mean, more honestly more than Jeremiah Smith.
I agree with that
Because
statement.
Jeremiah Smith, like he's generational, right? If he doesn't come here, who's your receiving core next year? Carnell Tate, Brandon Ennis,
Rogers, yeah.
Rogers,
Noah Rogers.
Ibuka might come back.
Mm-hmm.
Jaden Ballard's in that room.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's just, and Mylan Graham, you still have Mylan Graham coming too.
Mm-hmm.
And Brian Hartline has proven, like, he's a stud recruiter. I mean, and he's a developer. He's a very good developer. Larry Johnson has had that reputation. But like, if you go back back to Chase Young and before to now, like who's the last? Like forget the last Bosa or the last Young. Who's the last Taekwon Lewis? Who's the last Sam Hubbard? Like Tuimoloau has been good in spurts. Jack Sawyer has been good in spurts, but like those guys were like super recruits.
Yeah.
And
Look at
so
look at Zach Harrison,
yeah, he's another one. Like Jonathan Cooper
Jonathan
and
Cooper from.
yeah, like you just had all these 5-star guys who you're like, are you doing like you're playing well? Like and to me, that it has been a concern of mine and I love Larry Johnson. Like I don't want to hate on him. But like I think it was especially with losing Justin Scott. You had to get him and if you had to get Edric Houston just to keep faith for the defensive line. So keeping him was essential. Losing Jeremiah McClellan again, it's similar. Like I'd rather lose him than Jeremiah Smith, but I think losing him isn't that big. I think the way that they were able to keep everyone, and I think hearing Jeremiah Smith's quotes, I know his letter of intent was delayed. I don't think that was anything more than legal stuff. Like I don't think that was Miami making a push at the 11th hour or anything like that. But like the fact that they beat out a bunch of bags at Miami and they beat out Alabama, I think really does bode well. On the flip side of that, you always have to look at Ohio State differently than everybody else in the Big Ten because of they're not just even with the three straight losses against Michigan, you're still you're not only going up against Michigan, you're going up against Georgia and Alabama. And my question continues to be, where are the offensive linemen? And where are the waves of defensive linemen? And so the fact that they held it together was big. Now there's some smoke out there that Dominic McKinley is still in play.
Hmm.
I don't know how real that is. I don't know if you've heard anything about that or if you have
Mm-mm.
any intel on that.
Same as you. There's smoke, but that's it. It's all
Yeah.
I'm getting is smoke.
Yeah.
Which
So,
which which means that there's probably negotiating and back and forth with NIL collectives. Is
yes.
what that probably means.
Yeah. Which I think is to the point about NIL. I think it is easy to blame NIL for losses, and I think it's really good to champion NIL when there's success. I think it's big that it seems like the NIL collectives have gotten better, and I think I saw a tweet that Cardale Jones was like a big player in this, like having actual conversations with players and whatnot. So I think Ohio State is catching up. There's probably some outdated traditional stuff that Ohio State still has to get around. Like they have to come around on philosophically if they're going to live in this world of college football. But I'll say this: I'm less concerned about NIL collectives and more concerned about who's recruiting the players because I think Justin Fry as a developer, like the offensive line he was given this year and what he turned them into. I know you can say a lot about some of the deficiencies, but they were a lot better than what I expected coming into the season. And I thought they progressed. But you look at who they recruited. I know they're high on the Armstrong twins, and I know they're high on a couple other guys, but you miss out on Jordan Seaton. You miss out on some of those other highly touted guys, and that was the trend with Stradrawa. You miss out on a J.C. Latham. You miss out on some of these other guys. So, like, I'm concerned about that. Concerned about the running back room. I know Lyle, we got two, and James Peoples, I think, is probably the more complete back, but losing Lyle is a big deal. And I think this is the thing that confuses me. I'm like, how are we losing him to Miami? And I know money is probably the big answer, but I'm like, have you seen Miami the past 20 years since we beat them in Tempe?
Yeah.
Like, why are we losing recruit? Why? that I think that's the big question is, and I know the easy answer is money, but I think the key question that Ohio State inside the Woody, what they need to ask is, we should not be losing recruits to teams like Colorado or Miami or anybody like that. Why? And if it is NIL, then fix it. But there's something else going on, whether it's rumors of retirement for Larry Johnson or some of the coaches not wanting to recruit or they don't know how to close. I don't know. But you've got to ask those questions because when Ohio State comes calling, that should be, I mean, they're a premier program in the country. But I don't, if they don't figure out how to fix these little holes, and that's what they are, they're little holes. They're not gaping. They're not, but enough of cracks in the foundation that if you don't address them, they'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think you saw that in 2021 with the defense, right? You still see it, I think, at times on the line with the defensive line. You know, Notre Dame pushed us around. Michigan pushed us around a little bit. Rutgers pushed us around a little bit. So you've got to figure out how do we get this figured out? And I'm not sure. I think if anything, this proved that the NIL is actually starting to get better,
Hmm.
which then leaves it back on the coaches who are doing the recruiting.
Honest answer, my man. Appreciate it. Plug the Big Ten football talk podcast one more time for us, buddy.
Yeah, so you can catch us Mondays and Thursdays, although this Monday is Christmas, so don't listen to my podcast. Celebrate with your family. Go worship and have fun. Open lots of good presents. But we'll be on Tuesday this upcoming week. But typically it's Mondays and Thursdays. We drop typically at 7 a.m. You can hit us on the commute to work. But yeah, follow us Apple, Spotify, Google. You can follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. And yeah, definitely that's where you can catch us. And would love to interact on social media with you guys. So
Please like, share, subscribe. We appreciate that. It does help the channel. And make sure you guys go check out the Big Ten Football Talk podcast. I'm sure Zach will appreciate that. Zach, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
yeah, thank you, Eric.
I
Appreciate
can,
it.
usually I say this to some of our guests and they don't answer back. OH,
IO.
go Bucks.